Hello, everyone. I'm Tim Sargent. I'm Director of the Domestic Policy Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa. The issue of internal trade barriers in Canada is one that has recently become very much in the spotlight, given the economic uncertainty caused by our noisy neighbour to the south. I'm therefore delighted to have with me Trevor Tombe. Trevor is Professor of Economics at the University of Calgary, where he's the Director of Fiscal and Economic Policy at the School of Public Policy. He's also an MLI Senior Fellow. He's going to talk about his recent paper for MLI, which is entitled Breaking Barriers: How Provinces Can Drive Canada's Prosperity by Unlocking Trade and Labour Mobility. And that's available on our website, www.macdonaldlaurier.ca. Trevor, how are you?
Not too bad. Thanks for having me on.
Okay. Thanks for being here. Why don't I pass it over to you for some opening remarks? I think you've got some fancy slides to show us, and then we'll dive straight into questions.
Sounds good. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. And thanks for everyone for taking the time to join today, or for others who are watching online later. I think this is a particularly important moment to be thinking about not just trade in general with issues that have come up with the United States, but between provinces too, as a way to not just help diversify our economic relationships, including with ourselves, but to boost Canada's productivity, growth, living standards, purchasing power of our income, and so much more. And so the paper that I'll be presenting today is kind of focused on ways for us to improve the ability to exchange across provincial borders. So Tim noted the title here that is available online, and I'll just take a few minutes at the beginning here to walk through some of the high-level takeaways from the paper itself. Now, internal trade, it's a critical component of Canada's economy, but many Canadians and many policymakers, when speaking on the issue publicly, tend to focus on alcohol. This does receive a disproportionate amount of the attention, both beer and wine, and it is certainly important. There are real barriers here, often because of government wholesalers or government-owned retailers that have biased procurement, focusing on local suppliers rather than brands or products from across the country. And so it's an issue, and consumers would benefit from more variety, potentially lower prices as well. But this is less than 1% of the total amount of trade that occurs across provinces within Canada. And so I think leads us to some intuition that is potentially missing how important internal trade liberalization can be for the economy, what the challenges are, and what some of the options are for governments beyond just wine and beer trade. So I think this is one graphic that I always have in mind that I like to show around how important internal trade is relative to international. So internal trade today, it's just a little under 1/5 of total economic activity. So it is a meaningful share of the total amount of output that we produce being shipped across borders, or the total amount of consumer spending allocated to imports from elsewhere in Canada. But notice that it's roughly half the size of what we observe international trade to be. So north-south flows, especially between Canada and the United States, but trade beyond the US as well, is just quite a bit larger as a share of Canada's overall economy than internal trade. But this is a relatively new development in recent decades. If we go back to the early 1980s, we had internal and international trade that were roughly the same size, at each about 1/4 of total economic activity. Internal trade, though, has since declined in importance from that 1/4 to less than 1/5 today. Well, international trade has increased. And we've really signed many international free trade agreements with the US, with more recently the TPP for Pacific countries, CETA with various countries in Europe, now kind of by default, also including the United Kingdom. So there has been significant policy moves to facilitate international exchange, and not the same kind of effort directed internally at removing these barriers that we face. So what are the barriers? Well, internationally, we have barriers that are largely in the form of tariffs, quotas, but also regulatory challenges that buyers and sellers face when crossing an international border. Internally, we don't have tariffs or quotas or anything of the sort, but we do have regulations and standards and certifications and credentials that vary from one part of the country to another. And I think it's helpful to think about what makes internal trade a little bit different than international trade. So here's the latest data for 2023. On the left, you see interprovincial trade, where services are about 60% of the total value exchanged across provincial boundaries. Whereas in international trade, it's about 80% goods, 20% services. So when you picture interprovincial trade, you should picture things like professionals selling their service to clients, financial institutions providing services to others, transportation and wholesaling firms providing services to clients. Goods is important, very important internally, but services is a majority of those flows. And the barriers here are really largely about whether the regulations in one part of the country are different. So if you're a provider of a service or the manufacturer of a good in Ontario, say, you might abide by local requirements in that province, but you may not comply with regulations of another. And so to design your product in a way that's compliant with both, or to go through the inspections or certification process in another jurisdiction, or as a professional service provider, you might have credentials that are valid in one jurisdiction, but not another. And there are hundreds of such credentialing issues. So internal trade costs are really about differences in the rules of the game that prevail across the country. And Canada being highly decentralized means that those differences touch on almost all aspects of economic exchange that you might have in mind. So liberalizing internal trade has been the focus of policymakers recently and among some policymakers previously, and also the topic of papers that MLI has put out over the years, including some of my own work with Ryan Minucha recently on trucking and what are called mutual recognition agreements, and really just ways of thinking about smoothing out differences in the rules of the game across the country. And that's valuable. Harmonizing regulations, aligning standards and certifications, that can absolutely facilitate economic transactions from one province to another. But what I wanted to do in this paper was illustrate the potential and significant magnitude of gains that are available to a province that moves on its own, unilaterally lowering the cost of importing from another province. Reaching agreement between 10 provinces, 3 territories, plus the federal government is difficult and slow. But a province that wants to capture some of the gains from internal trade liberalization can do so, if it wishes, on its own. And this kind of unilateral move would involve recognizing the credentials or regulations or what have you that prevail in another province as equivalent to complying with any kind of local standard or local regulation. And any province can do that with a snap of a policy finger, if you will. And here what we're illustrating is the first, I think, set of key results in the paper. The gains that a province could achieve if it could lower import costs internally from another province by about 10%. Now, this is just to illustrate how important internal trade is for economic activity. Whether a 10% reduction in costs is feasible in one sector or another is a separate question. But here we see if Ontario, say, unilaterally moves, no province reciprocates, but Ontario just makes it easier to import, each 10% reduction in costs would boost Ontario's GDP by about 2%. Or, you scale this linearly. If Ontario lowers import costs by about 1%, then Ontario's economy would grow by 0.2. Smaller provinces, notice, in Atlantic Canada or Manitoba and Saskatchewan, they have bigger gains, significantly larger gains from easing unilaterally the cost of buying from another province, with PEI topping the list at each percentage point reduction in import costs, boosting its economy by about 0.6%. For many provinces, this is also a majority of the available gains that can be achieved through full liberalization involving all provinces and territories working together. So what I'm illustrating here is the same 10% reduction, again, just for uniformity and purposes of comparison. In dark blue That's the unilateral gains that you can achieve on your own without any partner at all. And then you can add to that the additional gains that would accrue from full liberalization. So everyone working together to liberalize internal trade definitely results in larger gains, but it is slower and more difficult. Most of the gains for most of the provinces can be achieved unilaterally. Look at Alberta. Fully 2.8 percentage points of the available gains, so it's about 2/3 of the gains, can be achieved by that province on its own. Or Newfoundland and Labrador, 4.1 out of the total 4.5 that's available can be achieved unilaterally without any partner reciprocating. For not all provinces, it's a majority. Look at Ontario, for example, 1.9 through unilateral gains, where it's 4.8 in total. But many provinces have the option of capturing economic gains from liberalization even without any agreement by others. And that, I think, is the most important contribution of the paper, to illustrate that unilateral moves can yield most of the benefits. And this is contrary to some intuition. I think many people have in mind that gains from trade come purely from exports, and lowering import costs would necessarily not be as advantageous economically for the jurisdiction. But that's just not the case. Lower import costs, lower prices for consumers, absolutely, but it also lowers input costs for businesses and intermediate inputs, capital goods, especially inputs in the form of services that companies use to produce yet other goods and services. If we unilaterally move as a province, it'll lower business costs, making the economy more attractive for other businesses to locate within. So not only lowering costs and prices, but also increasing inflows of investment and other potential benefits as a result. One final note before I conclude these opening remarks is that the gains are also especially large when you move in areas of the economy that are important input suppliers. So I'll leave it for folks interested in how I measure the importance of a sector in terms of its supplying inputs to others, but just picture an upstream entity selling mostly to other businesses rather than consumers. So finance, professional services, wholesale, transport warehousing, a lot of manufacturing. If a province were to move unilaterally in these areas, then the gains would be especially large. And in areas like services, professional, scientific, and technical services, the big barriers are in the form of credentials that are just not recognized. If you're licensed to practice in one province, you are perhaps unlikely to be licensed in another, and that's a real challenge for you supplying your services. So a province could just recognize as valid any credential that exists issued by any provincial jurisdiction in Canada. And that kind of a unilateral move, that's really at the core of the analysis of the paper, to illustrate that any province on its own can achieve significant economic benefits by moving alone unilaterally, and of course, working towards full liberalization with others over time. So I'll end it here and turn it back to Tim. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Trevor, for that, I think, very succinct introduction to this topic. We're now going to move to the Q&A session. We have some questions that folks have sent in prior to the webinar, but you're also welcome to ask Trevor any questions you like using the chat function. Just write your questions in there and we'll try to get to them during the webinar. So maybe I can kick off, Trevor, with one of my own. As an economist myself, I find all of this very, very compelling. I guess the question is, why have these barriers persisted so long? And who is benefiting or thinks that they benefit from these barriers?
Yeah, that's a great question, an important one. It's right to note that internal trade has been an irritant that Canada's economy has faced for some time. We have several royal commissions in the past, as far back as 1940, pointing to internal trade as a problem for the national economy. You can even find some of the original fathers of Confederation, Alexander Galt, I'm thinking of a particular speech way back in the 19th century, pointing to some of these barriers. I think The reason why they persist is a couple-fold. First, Canada is deliberately a decentralized country. We have very different interests and circumstances from one part of the country to another. And with that decentralization naturally comes a lot of responsibility on the part of provinces that when setting rules would just kind of perhaps even just randomly arriving at different rules and regulations. So not deliberately trying to inhibit trade. And so when harmonizing with others or when recognizing as valid the credentials of others, that can potentially limit the degree of autonomy or independence of a provincial government to set its own rules of the game as it sees fit. And so there's going to be among some potentially just a natural resistance to giving up some of that independent autonomy or authority. But then there are also entrenched economic interests that might resist reforms. And I'm thinking in particular in our ability to exchange services. There's hundreds and hundreds of province-level credentialing regulatory bodies that do like to ensure they effectively control the supply of some of these important professional services and service providers within a jurisdiction. Potentially allowing for higher incomes of that by restricting the number that can practice within a jurisdiction. And if we were to unilaterally or even jointly recognize each other's credentials, that would weaken the power of those independent regulatory bodies. And so they might naturally resist moves by government to reform. And that's not dissimilar, I should be clear, with international trade liberalization challenges politically. Those that are protected from competition from other jurisdictions typically know who they are and know the benefits that they receive from them, whereas the costs and consequences of these barriers are diffuse across the population, where each of us is incurring costs that we might not even notice, whereas those benefiting from protection definitely know who they are. And so the lobbying effort is pretty asymmetric between those who would oppose reform versus those who are few and far between who would be pushing for it.
Well, that makes sense. Which provinces do you think have been or going forward are likely to be the most enthusiastic about this kind of agenda, and which provinces do we see as likely laggards in this movement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think something that has changed quite a bit just in the last few weeks. So in Nova Scotia, we've had Premier Tim Houston there move in a really, really interesting way that could potentially shake up the whole ballgame here on internal trade. That province has put forward, and it's still in process. I believe it's past second reading. Not quite formally passed, but I suspect will be, what's called the Free Trade and Mobility Within Canada Act. And it's a fairly simple act. And the purpose of the act is quite clear. It lays out that it is to remove all barriers to trade in goods, services, and investment. And I would just like to underline the word all, because it is quite an ambitious act, effectively stating that Nova Scotia will eliminate any requirement for additional fees or testing or inspections or requisite standards and meeting this, that, and the other regulation for any good manufactured or produced in any other province that reciprocates with Nova Scotia. So it might be an item that technically doesn't abide by a Nova Scotia local regulation, but if it does abide by, say, an Alberta, where I am, regulation, and these two provinces agree to reciprocate this treatment with each other, then Nova Scotia would allow the good in, and so too would Alberta. But the bill doesn't stop there. It goes on to services. And as I noted, 60% of internal trade is services, and huge licensing restrictions there. The legislation effectively directs the licensing authorities to waive registration and licensing requirements for anyone already registered or licensed in a reciprocating province. And so I think it is really hard to overstate the potential significance of this if other provinces take it up. And I think that's the open question here. Who and how many might reciprocate? But what Nova Scotia's put forward is perhaps the single most ambitious internal trade reform ever put forward by anyone in Canadian history by a very wide margin, and I wish them all the greatest success with that. Now, the second component of your question is who's a laggard. So I do have an answer, but I want to qualify it with there might be legitimate non-economic objectives that one wants to achieve with barriers regarding other provinces. And so it's completely fair enough if one, eyes wide open, makes this trade-off to say we're willing to incur an economic cost to achieve this particular non-economic objective. And that brings us to Quebec, where some of the regulatory barriers that exist there around language, around labeling, around their distinct legal system might motivate distinct regulations and would naturally lead to resistance to mutually or unilaterally recognize as valid in Quebec things that are valid elsewhere. And, you know, again, economically, I'd say that that is a position that would lag behind certainly what Tim Houston has put forward, but maybe, you know, a trade-off one's willing to make if you put high enough weight on things like language rights, things like that. And I think that's a separate debate about where people come down on the trade-offs. And that's fair enough. But economically speaking, I think there is now a very clear difference between Nova Scotia and many other provinces.
Okay. Getting a couple of questions from the audience on the chat here. So I want to go to one of those. So David is asking, how much of the estimated import costs are due to interprovincial barriers? And how big are the economic gains from credential recognition? So people flows versus trade flows.
Yeah, great question. So first, the credentials recognition is not just about labor mobility. It is also about the trade in services. So if you're a professional located in one part of the country, you can provide your service to clients in another province without moving. But your ability to do so depends on whether you hold appropriate licensing and credential requirements to abide by perhaps the multiple jurisdictions that you're operating in. So there are gains from services trade liberalization that are distinct from the potential additional gains from improved labor mobility that credentials recognition would come with. So how much of the estimated import costs are because of interprovincial trade barriers? Well, that I would direct folks to a different paper that I wrote through Macdonald-Laurier Institution with Ryan Minucha back in 2022 on the gains from mutual recognition as a way forward. And there we do present some estimates of the actual magnitude of the trade costs, and they are much larger in services than in goods, potentially and perhaps mostly because of these credential differences that exist for hundreds and hundreds of occupations across the country. And so there are bigger economic gains to liberalizing that area of the economy than goods. And so I'm somewhat encouraged by what sounds like a potential agreement in the works. We'll see where they land, but it does sound like provinces have put themselves on a path towards a potentially broad set of credential recognitions before June 1, or at least that's what they've publicly communicated. We'll see how they follow through on that, whether it's as ambitious as the unilateral move, at least if provinces reciprocate that Nova Scotia has put on the table. But that's where some of the biggest potential gains are in credentials recognition.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about the federal government's potential role and what the federal government's been up to here. So we had a question from Geordie who asked, of the 38 items brought forward to the CFTA, that's the Canada Free Trade Agreement, reconciliation and cooperation table since 2018, a lot have either been partially or fully resolved. Given the recent flurry of political announcements, what's your understanding of the status of these items and the remaining 19 items which are either inactive or have been deferred? So how is that federal-led process been doing?
I wouldn't actually characterize this as a federal-led process. It's a process that provinces have set up and agreed to, and all participate in. And there are a lot of items that have been identified by parties, and only, I should say, governments can identify an issue for the RCTs to work through. And this has made some interesting progress in a lot of different files. And they have reports on their progress on all of these that they issue regularly on their website. I believe they've issued an update just a couple of weeks ago on different issues that have been identified and what's signed and what are not signed. And so there are things that are ongoing in terms of the discussions. I think the biggest potential one is around building codes and how much alignment there is there. You know, that's relevant for construction firms because then you could potentially source more material and inputs in a common way, even for projects that are located in different jurisdictions. There's ongoing discussions around certain occupational health and safety regulations that are proceeding. So this is good work, but slow, because you have to have a province that identifies a barrier and then they work through typically to harmonize them or agree to something that would be uniform and adopted by all. And so this unilateral move here wouldn't be to, I guess, replace that work, but it's an option that's available to any province that wants to prioritize its own economy and its own productivity and the purchasing power of incomes of its own residents faster than what the RCT can possibly accomplish. And I guess more generically, the role of the federal government generally is it does provide a lot of resources to staff the secretariat that helps manage that process through the CFTA. It's also potentially there to keep it on the agenda, especially at a time like this where so many other issues are going to be dominating the priority list of first ministers and premiers. It's pretty easy for this issue to fall off the table because it is critically important, but it's not perhaps on any given day the most important item. So the Fed's there, to keep it on the agenda, keep pushing it forward. But because of the dominance of provinces in many areas of regulation and standards, there's not a lot that the Feds can unilaterally do. I think some of the more interesting ideas, one has come out actually by Pierre Poilievre, I believe it was a couple of weeks ago, where it was an idea put forward to have a new federal transfer. I believe it's called the Canada bonus. I might have that wrong, but a federal transfer that pays more to provinces that move more to liberalize internal trade. And so that's typically how federal governments move the needle in policy areas that are outside their jurisdiction. They bring some money to the table to incentivize provinces. And so that's one potential option that has been put forward.
And of course, for the federal government, there's obviously an advantage to seeing interprovincial trade liberalization because the GDP will rise and tax revenues, including the federal government, will rise.
Yeah, and for context there, the estimates that Ryan and I put forward in that past paper, which I'm very pleased to see has actually been quoted quite a bit, that paper at the high end has gains to Canada's economy on the order of about 200 billion we put forward then. Now, it's been a few years since, and so the economy has grown, and so now those gains closer to 250 billion because it's about an 8% boost to productivity. And so that's very large. Now, you wouldn't immediately see the gain, snap your fingers, and suddenly the economy is that much bigger. It would take time for investment to shift, for business activity to change, for highly productive firms to scale up, lower productivity firms to scale down and release some of those resources to others who could better utilize them. And so it would take time. But those gains are quite significant. And roughly speaking, the federal government, like many, generates most of its tax revenue from taxes on income and consumption, which move with the economy. So if the economy increases by 8%, then roughly speaking, so too would government revenue. And that makes it quite valuable, not just for the Feds, but for all governments in Canada to prioritize this issue and others that boost growth and productivity.
question here from that was submitted before from Laura, which gets to whether the federal government might be part of the problem as well as part of the solution. What role do burdensome federal regulations have on the chill to interprovincial trade, and can the federal government be convinced to remove them?
So there are certainly some areas where the federal government does have a central role on issues related to interprovincial trade. I think about agricultural inspections as one example. This is where you have provincial inspection regimes that may apply, but for interprovincial shipments, you also have the Canada Food Inspection Agency potentially being involved. And so that's an area that would add costs to the trade in agriculture, just to take one example. Infrastructure is another interesting area of interprovincial trade that is unrelated to provincial policy differences, but your physical ability to move a good from point A to point B depends on your capacity to do so, and that's largely rail and trucking on highways. So about, I don't want to get my stats wrong, but either 2/3 or 3/4 of interprovincial trade is done by truck in terms of value. But in terms of volume, about 2/3 is done by rail. And so to the extent that federal policy directly affects the operational efficiency and productivity and underlying capacity of existing rail and our ability to build new rail lines, that's where the federal government would certainly have an outsized role in terms of infrastructure. Also, interestingly, an area where we're hearing many talk about the need to have more infrastructure and transportation capacity in Canada, and that can help move the needle on internal trade as well.
I want to talk a little bit about our current economic situation, and particularly what's going on south of the border and the attitude of the current administration to trade with Canada. I think a lot of people are hoping that, to some extent, greater trade within Canada can offset loss of potential markets in the US. I mean, how realistic is that? I mean, how long would that take if that's possible?
So a short answer is it is potentially possible in time. So the estimates from this previous MLI paper was that the potential aggregate productivity gains could be between 4.4 and 7.9, depending on the methods and some scenarios there. But even at the low end of gains on the order of just under 4.5%, that's larger than the potential consequence of a 25% broad across the board tariff levied by the United States plus similar retaliation levied by us. The Bank of Canada's got perhaps the most recent estimate of what a trade war might mean. And they report different scenarios, but roughly speaking, you have about a 2.5-point hit to productivity in year one, additional 1.5% hit in year two before returning to trend growth, with an economy that's roughly 4% permanently smaller than it otherwise would be. And so that's the consequence of the trade disruption with the US, but the gains from internal trade liberalization are larger than that. There's not a lot that we can do to avoid short-term consequences of abrupt changes in US trade policy. But if we can dramatically liberalize trade, and concretely that would mean everybody reciprocating Tim Houston's fine offer that is on the table, that would be a massive improvement in the policy landscape. It would take time for investment decisions to respond, for the scale and composition of output in different regions to respond. It is tough to say how long it would take, but it would be on the order of years, to put it bluntly. Like how quickly we would converge to our new higher potential output level would take several years. But we would eventually have an economy that is larger, despite the US tariff, than it would be had we not taken action on internal trade. Now, we should be taking action on internal trade, whatever the United States does. I want to be crystal clear about that. But the potential gains of improving our own productivity are larger than the consequences of trade disruption with the US.
I wanted to ask a little bit about how we compare to other countries. Yeah, the chart you kicked off with showed that we rely more on international trade than internal trade by some metrics. Is that unusual? Are the level of internal trade barriers that we have, unusual by international standards, especially if we compare to peer countries, countries like Australia or the UK or in Europe? So how do we compare to others?
Yeah, we do lag behind many other countries when it comes to internal trade for a couple of reasons. One is policy lags behind other decentralized federations. So the United States is one example of a decentralized federation, but in the economic sphere, their federal government does loom larger than ours, with their interstate commerce clause being a little bit more powerful than the equivalent that we have. But they also have many U.S. states that have moved far beyond what Canadian provinces have. So credentials recognition, for example, of just unilaterally recognizing the credentials from other states as valid for their own is policy that is in place right now in roughly 36 states already. Australia, also a federation where their states are relatively significant in many areas. In the 1990s, they adopted a broad mutual recognition agreement between their subnational governments. And so they've moved down the policy road quite a bit further than we have. And so there's a little bit of policy catch up for us to do. But in other countries, I think about in Europe, the EU is the level of government that's responsible for much of the regulatory landscape that exists there. So there's naturally harmonization because there's just the one order of government that's setting policy in a lot of important areas. And so the trade-off there is it's a more centralized approach to economic policy, moving away from the decentralized one. And I should say there are benefits of decentralization. We set up Canada the way we did for a reason. You have the ability to adopt different policies where it makes sense in one part of the country. You have experimentation that's possible by one province. Then we can learn lessons from that elsewhere in the country. So we have a kind of policy laboratory, if you will. But yeah, the trade-off is that you have differences in the rules and regulations that can inhibit economic exchange. So there's policy solutions there, the unilateral recognition being the fastest one that we could imagine. And there's experience with that in the US. Or there's more mutual recognition where we have experience in Australia, but Canada really does need to move in one direction or another. And again, I can't refer to Nova Scotia frequently enough. Like that's the type of policy that would move the needle. And that's the type of policy that in many areas does exist in other jurisdictions.
Of course, your home province of Alberta has, for many years has led the way on reducing interprovincial trade barriers, I think. Can you maybe talk us through the Alberta experience and with some of the other Western provinces, and how far along this road to policies like mutual recognition have they traveled?
Yeah, great question. So the 4 Western provinces are currently a part of what's called the New West Partnership Agreement, which does push a little bit further at trying to facilitate investment and labor mobility and trade for those provinces beyond what at the time that this agreement was set up existed nationally. And it has had some measurable effects on the costs of trade. So myself and some researchers at the IMF published a paper back in 2019 where we do a couple of things in that paper, but we estimate the effect of these trade clubs, if you will, including the New West Partnership Agreement. And we did indeed measurably and statistically significantly estimated trade costs to fall between those member provinces of the New West Partnership Agreement. Not much, about 2.5%, a little bit under that. So measurable and had real economic benefits, but not dramatic, because it was not an agreement that by default allowed all the rules and regulations of one province to be valid in all others. It just sort of nudged us towards better harmonization and recognition at the margin. Fast forward a few years, in 2019, we had a government in Alberta led by former Premier Jason Kenney, who I think it's fair to say on a personal level, really prioritized this policy area, and that kept the government here focused on it. We unilaterally dropped all of the exemptions, not immediately, but we eventually got rid of them. So dropping most at first of the Canada Free Trade Agreement exemptions that Alberta had previously had, and putting forward in the summer of 2019 a goal of having broad mutual recognition of rules, regulations, credentials, and so on across Canada. And what I think the Premier then did, what was very interesting, was to say if there wasn't an agreement on broad mutual recognition, then Alberta would move unilaterally within a year. So it was setting a clock on, okay, we can move forward together, but if it takes longer than a year, then Alberta was committed to moving on its own, which is kind of what this paper that we're talking about today is putting forward as a really valuable option for provinces to consider. Unfortunately, COVID did change, naturally, the capacity and priorities of the government to follow through on that. There's lots of other things on its plate, and so it didn't come about. And then, of course, we changed premiers, and different priorities naturally result from that. So we haven't seen much by way of additional moves by Alberta since Premier Kenney's original push in that direction.
Great. Moving to some other audience questions. Question from Acerb. Doesn't dropping barriers expose provinces to the risk of not being self-sufficient in the same way that we discovered that risk with the United States?
That's an interesting one. So trade has benefits in the form of specializing in areas that you are particularly good at, and trading with others who specialize in areas that they are particularly good at. That's one form of gain. Second form is scale. Market size matters to scale up operations of productive firms. That allows them to spread fixed costs over a larger number of units, lowering the overall cost and price for consumers and business buyers in the end. So there are significant gains from trade, and there are significant productivity gains from not trying to do everything yourself. Just like we as individuals specialize in the one thing where we have a job, or two things if we have multiple jobs, and trade with others for the items that we do not specialize in producing, or would do particularly poorly if we tried to do them. But yeah, generically, it's an interesting point that you're then exposed to the potential economic or policy developments of another jurisdiction. And so that's a trade-off. That's a potential risk to keep in mind. And where that trade-off, where one comes down in terms of voluntarily being poorer permanently so as not to be exposed to adverse policy shocks elsewhere, that's interesting. I personally tend to think we should put more weight on the permanent productivity boosts, and we can use those additional resources to perhaps accumulate investment and capital and savings to make our economy more resilient in the face of potential external shocks. And I'll note that one of the reasons why Canada is particularly exposed is not because we trade a lot with the United States, but because productivity growth in Canada has been very low over the past decade. Our economy, had we just kept up with the normal pattern that prevailed for 20 years prior to 2015, the economy today would be about 18% larger than it is, giving us the capacity to absorb and manage difficult times, even if those difficult times start externally. So I'd say that that's an interesting trade-off that one needs to weigh, but the benefits of stronger and greater economic activity and productivity and real incomes shouldn't be understated.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Canada, being geographically very large, has quite a diverse economy. Nova Scotia doesn't have much in the way of oil, and on the other hand, Alberta, there isn't much of a fishing industry. So you do have that kind of diversity. The
gains from exchange are larger when the differences are larger, which you're right to note, exists within Canada as well.
Mm-hmm. I can't resist asking a Trump-related question. I mean, you've been quite eloquent about the benefits from trade, and as a former deputy of trade, I mean, I find that quite convincing as well as being an economist, and kind of seemed like certainly by the early 2010s, we'd kind of got people convinced of that logic. But of course, Donald Trump, for one, does not seem very convinced by that logic, and many of the people who vote for him are also not very convinced by that logic. So, if you don't mind going a little off piece, why do you think it is that we've seen this turnaround, not perhaps in Canada, but certainly in the US and perhaps in the UK and a few other countries as well, about the pros and cons of free trade?
Yeah, so I think that's not actually that far off the topic here. So trade certainly boosts productivity and growth on average, but like most economic and policy and technological developments, there can be winners and losers. And in the context of the United States, increasing imports from China in particular, but also from others, there is some really interesting work showing it might have resulted in a little lower employment in manufacturing, especially in certain parts of the United States. So the Midwest comes to mind, certainly electorally important parts of the United States that might have been adversely affected from increases in trade. And the job creation in export-oriented sectors in the United States that have a particular advantage relative to other countries, that might require different skills, different experiences in different parts of the country. And so to the extent that many individuals might not have those skills or have challenges moving, they're then going to be living and exposed to what's a negative shock for certain localities. And so there are distributional implications, and depending on how you weight the well-being of one group versus another might lead you to conclude that trade is, in a normative sense, good or bad, depending on that distribution. So while the president's rhetoric, as many politicians' rhetoric is perhaps oversimplifying, I think that those thoughtful individuals in the administration would not argue with the generic point that trade can boost average incomes and productivity. I think they just put a lot of weight on manufacturing in particular, especially in the Midwest. Or that's my read of it. Same might exist in Canada as well. And so you may have parts of the country, certain sectors that might not be competitive relative to those same sectors in other locations. And so to the extent that you'd have some provinces putting weight on the well-being of certain geographic locations or certain demographic groups in the labor force and worried about their ability to sustain what is their current operations in the face of increased internal import competition, that's kind of a similar potential political dynamic at play here as well.
Mm-hmm. Of course, Canada has much more of a social safety net than the US, and not just for individuals, but also for provinces as well, which may make it easier for Canada to embrace free trade than many Americans.
Indeed, that's a really excellent point. I mean, programs, of course, it transfers to people through EI, but also lots of other programs are one thing. And then for a province as a whole, if there's something that affects its economy negatively, that would over time show up as fiscal capacity changes that would be covered by equalization. I'll note, though, that at least the estimates that I've put forward on the gains from internal trade liberalization, lower income provinces in Canada would gain more than high-income provinces. So internal trade liberalization, interestingly, is not just about increasing the Canadian average. And it's one thing if, say, Ontario were to benefit so much more and pull up the average, even if other provinces lag behind. Every province gains, and lower-income province gains even more. So it raises the productivity and shrinks regional inequality. Which is a real benefit. And so I'd say that the winners and losers here is certainly not one about one province or another, but it might be about certain types of sectors or certain types of skills that are only useful in certain sectors that might shrink in certain regions. So very much narrower than overall provinces. And connected to transfers, we have an equalization program now, and we will go down this road that's kind of fixed in dollar terms. But if we had a program with a formula and principles-based determination of the amount, then internal trade liberalization would actually shrink the size of the equalization program because it would shrink the degree of inequality.
Right, and there could be some perverse incentives associated with that.
Fair enough, yeah.
Yeah. Just a reminder to the audience that we've only got a few minutes left, but please do, if you have additional questions, put them in the chat. One question for the chat, just you mentioned Nova Scotia in particular. If we eliminate all interprovincial regulatory barriers, what would be the boost? Just remind us what the boost would be to Nova Scotia's GDP.
Yeah, so what I present in this paper is focused not so much on internal trade liberalization across the board, but illustrating that unilateral action by a province can achieve most of the gains. So for Nova Scotia, for every 1% reduction in import costs, unilateral reductions in import costs, I estimate that province's real GDP would increase by 0.4%, 0.41%. Now, in another hypothetical, if we could achieve full liberalization and eliminating all of these policy barriers right across the board, then the gains to Nova Scotia's economy would be larger, but not something I specifically estimate in this particular paper. This is really just illustrating that unilateral moves get you very far along, even if you can't reach agreement with anybody, which is a point that I think is missing in the policy debate today.
Great. Just a couple of questions now to finish off. You're here in Ottawa. Everyone's expecting the writ to drop and the federal election to be launched within a matter of days. So I have a couple of questions that get to that. Firstly, David's asking, have any party platforms, either now or in the last 20 years or so, seriously tackled this issue?
So it's certainly an issue that comes up in campaigns, but never with a lot of policy meat behind it. There's often a lot of conversations around the need to liberalize internal trade, but then not a lot of follow through in terms of what the government's actually proposing to do about it. And I don't just mean this with respect to the federal government, but also among many provinces. So now my impression is it's a fairly unique moment where a lot of fairly concrete policy ideas are on the table. So Pierre Poilievre, for example, I noted that earlier in terms of having a federal transfer that rewards action on internal trade, bringing some dollars to the table to nudge provinces to move forward. That's an interesting one. And now Prime Minister Mark Carney, at least during the leadership race, and I suppose, yeah, still now in public statements around the need to have not 13 economies, but one, has also put forward things like having federal regulatory and review requirements waived if projects go through provincial ones already. And that's really interesting. Now we have both major parties having concrete suggestions on the table, and there are others from both. And so this is, I think, the first election where we have seen kind of agreement on the problem, agreement on the need to do something a little different, and actually putting down some ideas, taking that final step of saying how we might nudge the needle. So I'm quite a bit more optimistic than I have been before, although a lot of devil is left in the details, and so we'll have to see. But this might be a unique election in terms of internal trade policy issues, to the extent that even it becomes like a key part of the campaign. But it'll certainly be a little chapter, hopefully, in policy documents that we spend at least a couple of days on.
Well, that seems an appropriately optimistic note upon which to end. And certainly, Trevor, I think you can take some credit for the salience of this issue and the fact that it's not just being recognized as a problem, but people are actually thinking through concrete solutions, although of course President Trump must also take some of the credit, which I'm sure he would be delighted to receive. So thanks again, Trevor. Thanks very much to the audience for participating. Thanks for a lot of great questions. And I'll just close by saying that everything we do at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is made possible by generous donors. If you enjoyed the event, please consider supporting our work. You can go on our website, and please do tune in to future webinars. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening, a good afternoon, or a good morning.